upgrade your internet connection or something to solve the problems you've had?
No, I'm just going to pray to the Lord God that it doesn't screw up again. That's all. I actually have a pretty good internet connection, but just, in the I'm in Bert's neighborhood, So when Bert and I are both on the internet, you get fluctuations because the two of us suck up so much internet
That's because
energy.
we share the cost of a single node. We
I
each
think,
bought our own, would be different.
yeah.
We're on AT&T, by the way. We just switched recently.
Did you? We got off of AT&T because it kept crashing. So now we're on Spectrum.
Yeah, we came from Spectrum.
Oh, see, so the universe is in balance, you see.
And look up the comic strip Pearls Before Swine. They had a comic strip today about, the name of Wi-Fi networks where somebody was tapping into somebody else's, and and the name of the network was like, "Stop tapping into my network, you cheat."
Really? Seriously?
Yeah, go Google Pearls Before Swine.
Oh, there we are. We're on.
Funny.
Okay. All right. So let's begin. It's nice to see everybody. Happy unholiday. There's no more holidays for a little while. We're in the middle of the Omer, and thankfully it's a little quiet in the Jewish world. So I'd like to return to our study of the Bible. And what we've been doing, at least before we broke for all these holidays, was to take a look at we're looking at the third section of the Hebrew Bible. The first section is the 5 books of the Torah. The next sections are the 8 books of the prophets. And then we get a section of miscellany. And miscellany is called Ketuvim, writings. And it begins with these 2 gargantuan books, Psalms and Proverbs, and both of which are actually very traditional books, in some ways very conventional books. Psalms, which is a worshipful book, probably created by the priestly class of the first and second temple period, has a very, very conventional, traditional theology. Proverbs, which is the first book of what we call the wisdom tradition. So there are basically 3 sources of tradition in the Hebrew Bible. The first source is the priestly tradition, which is comprises the Torah, and it derives from Moses, from ancient sources, and from the priestly class, was held and protected by the priestly class. The second source, which is the prophetic tradition, which, as the name implies, are the words of the prophets. And the third source was the wisdom tradition, which was the province of the elders of the tribes. And there was the wisdom tradition doesn't purport to be divine knowledge passed down from heaven. The wisdom tradition is derived from people's experience. It's what we've learned from living in the world, passed on from generation to generation. And the book of Proverbs is the first great collection of the wisdom tradition, and it's the collection of all the conventional stuff, mostly very, very traditional, very, very deeply faithful and loyal to God, very consistent with the ethics, for example, and the spirituality of the Torah and the prophets. It's when you pass beyond the book of Proverbs that something remarkable happens. You find yourself in the province of a whole bunch of books whose intellectual and spiritual freedom is going to surprise you. So one of the first ones that we've looked at this for a couple of weeks now, is the book of Job. The book of Job is really not so much one book, but actually a sort of collage, an anthology, a collection of reflections on the question, is there a moral order in the universe? Does God reward goodness and punish evil? And if God rewards goodness and punishes evil, if there is a moral order in the universe, then why is it that we witness all around us evil things being rewarded and good people suffering? And it asks that question very frankly. And it's very, in some ways, it's very brutal in its skepticism about the traditional idea that, yeah, there's a God who's running everything. And the book of Job says, really? Then how come I'm seeing all this stuff going on around me? It's a very free book in that sense, a very free thinking book, almost atheistic, skeptical, certainly skeptical. I mean, it's not atheist in the sense that it does believe that there's a God, but it questions deeply the morality of that God and whether that God is really worthy of worship. And that really is what the book of Job does. So in a certain sense, here is a book which is in some ways a broadside attack on the ideology of the Torah, and it's in the Bible. This isn't some atheist philosopher giving a lecture. It's in the Bible. Now, the second book which we can include in this is the book of Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, which would normally have been the next book we would take a look at. But I thought instead we would take a look at something more fun. I made a mistake, because the book of Esther, which we're going to take a look at today, is in some ways even more radical than the book of Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes. That is to say that what we have in this third section of the Hebrew Bible is a whole bunch of books which really ask some very deep and skeptical and powerful questions about what we can really believe in and how to behave in this world, and what are the implications of what are the implications for our beliefs given the world as we know it, and what are the implications for our ethics given what we've learned about the world about us. Now, the book of Esther has a different style. The book of Job, as we saw, had three different literary styles. There was a prose beginning, sort of a fairy tale, and then you have a long section of philosophical dialogue, which was poetic, and then you had a short section of speeches at the end. The book of Esther is entirely narrative. There's no poetry in it. So that differs from Proverbs, and it differs from Psalms, and it differs from Job. And it seems like a sort of fairy tale, but much like the beginning of Job, it's a fairy tale with a real point to it, with a real sort of a zest to it. In fact, I'm going to suggest the following, that when you want to deliver a very difficult to hear truth, a truth that's difficult to hear, the very best way to deliver it is in a funny story. Sigmund Freud wrote a famous book about jokes. And he said that basically what a joke is a truth we don't want to face, wrapped up in something that makes us laugh. And that all jokes reveal things truths we don't want to face. And I think that the book of Esther is exactly that. I think the book of Esther is an incredibly radical theological book, and in many ways a pretty strongly radical political book, wrapped up in a crazy, wild, we would almost call it ribald, even slightly pornographic story. That's starting to wake you up, because you hear the word pornography and all of a sudden you say, what did he say? Right? Yeah, exactly that. If you read it the right way, with just a little bit of imagination, and it doesn't take a lot, you say like, wow, this is in the Bible? And that's where we get the book of Esther. So let's jump in. We all know this book from Purim, but I want to take a look very carefully at this text, because it is a remarkable, interesting piece of biblical writing. So here's where it starts. It happened in the days of Achashverosh. Now we know that Achashverosh is the Persian pronunciation of the name Artaxerxes. He was a great Persian emperor. Achashverosh, who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Nubia. So if you draw a line from India, Nubia is Sudan, from India to Sudan, it means like basically the whole southern part of the ancient world. In those days, when King Achashverosh occupied the royal throne in the fortress Shushan, the name of the Persian capital was Susa. So Shushan is actually a sort of Hebrew derivation of Susa. But Shushan is interesting because if you write out the word Shushan in Hebrew letters, it's Shin Shin Vav Nun. It spells Sason, which means happiness. In other words, he lives in the happiest place on earth. He lives in Disneyland. He lives in a fantasy land. In the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all the officials and courtiers, the administration of Persia and Media. Now, there is we're going to come across this many times in the book. There was a species of literature that was very popular at various points in history called Persian court dramas. Persian court dramas, Sinbad the Sailor, Aladdin, 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights, these kinds of stories were very, very popular. They drifted to Europe and they became very popular. And in all of them, one of the things that they marvel at is that the Persian government was always so heavily stacked with administrators and bureaucrats that you had to go through this maze of bureaucrats in order to get anything done. So here sits Achashverosh at the top of this pyramid of bureaucrats, of administrators, of clerks, of apparatchiks, and he's trying to give orders to run a kingdom. So finally, after 3 years, he finishes conquering the whole world. He gives a big banquet for everyone who works for him. The nobles and governors of the provinces in his service, all of these powerful people are gathered in the capital. For no fewer than 180 days, he displayed the vast riches of his kingdom and splendid glory of his majesties. We had a World's Fair. He had a World's Fair of all the stuff that he'd ripped off. Anyone ever been to the British Museum? Right? Over the door at the British Museum, they should have a sign going, look at all the stuff we stole. Right? We stole mummies from Egypt. We stole the friezes from the Acropolis. We stole art from Europe. Look at all the great stuff we stole. That's what he did too. He conquered the world, took its treasures, put it on display, proud of what he'd done. At the end of the period, the king gave a banquet for 7 days in the court of the king's palace garden for all the people who live in the fortress Shushan, high and low alike. This was not uncommon, by the way, even into the Middle Ages, even into the early modern times, that when a monarch or a noble person had a special occasion, he'd give a banquet for the whole town. And he'd invite the whole town up to his castle to have a banquet. And banquets, you'll see in this book, play a big role. Eating and drinking play a big role. In fact, every basic scene where we meet the king, he's at a banquet or a drinking party. Sounds like when I went to college. Right? Now let's stop for just a moment. Because up till now, you're just reading the story and it seems okay. But now you got to stop a second and say, wait a minute, what am I being told here? And I'm going to suggest to you that you're being told something pretty strange and pretty powerful, only it's being disguised. And that's really the story of the book of Esther. By the way, the name Esther, which we'll meet her in a little while. The name Esther, if in Hebrew, the word lahastir means to hide. This is a story about what is revealed and what is hidden, what is concealed and what is open. And you're going to see this again and again. And I'm going to suggest that in the whole book is about revealing and concealing. This is the interplay in the whole book. But here's the truth that I think that the book is concealing for us. I think it introduces us to Achashverosh. And at the beginning of the book, you think, well, that's sort of like, like all the prophetic books, for example, tell us that Isaiah prophesied in the reign of a certain king, or Jeremiah prophesied in the reign of first, but that's not what's being told here. We're being given much more detail about Achashverosh. And I want to suggest the reason why. The contrast here is with the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus. Think about how the book of Genesis begins. In the beginning, God created heaven and the earth was unformed and void, tohu vavohu, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters, and the Lord God said, let there be light, and there was light. And in the book of Exodus, you have the same thing, the enslavement of the Hebrew people, of the Israelite people, and then Moses is being sent by God. What the book of Esther is telling you is the world of this book is not the world of Genesis or Exodus. The world of Genesis and Exodus is ruled by a God who is moral, a God who stands on the side of justice, a God who wants to do what is right and wants to see what is right enforced in his world. The book of Esther is going to begin with a really interesting premise. What if that's not the real world? What if that's the fantasy? What if the world, in fact, is not ruled by God, but ruled by a drunk, foolish king? A drunk, foolish king who doesn't know right from wrong, who has no commitment to justice, who can't see beyond his immediate impulses. What kind of world would it be then? What would it mean to live in a world that is not governed by the Lord God, but governed by a drunk fool? What kind of world how would you have to behave in such a world? What would be called upon you? What would be the mitzvah? What mitzvot would be incumbent upon you if you lived in a world which wasn't ruled by a just and righteous king, but ruled instead by a drunk fool? How would you have to comport yourself? And that's what the beginning of the book is really suggesting, only it's a little bit hidden. And right away, we begin with a king. And what is the king doing? He's not doing what you imagine a king should do. He's not bringing justice and ruling his people with law and order. He's not teaching his people to be great citizens. What is he doing? He's getting everybody drunk. He wants everybody loaded, just like he is. And so we begin with a wine feast where the whole world is a mess of drunken fools. That's the picture of the world in the book of Exodus. That's a very different world than we meet in Genesis or in Exodus. That's the book we see. That's what we meet in Esther, a world full of drunk fools. Now, how do you live in a world full of drunk fools? Just before we get into that, it's going to throw in these details. And you have to wonder why the details. Are the details here in order to, to just open up our imagination of the story? Or are the details here to keep hinting at something? So here we go. At the end of the period, at the end of the 6 months of the World's Fair, where he displayed all of his riches, the king gave a banquet for 7 days in the court of the king's palace garden for all the people who lived in the fortress Shushan, high and low and alike. The whole populace of the town was invited up to the palace for 7 days of eating, of wild, unrestrained eating and drinking. And then the Bible, the text, throws in this little detail. There were hangings of white cotton and blue wool, caught up by cords of fine linen and purple wool to silver rods and alabaster columns. And there were couches of gold and silver on a pavement of marble, alabaster, mother and pearl, and mosaics. Why did we need to know that? Why do we need to know the interior decorating of the palace party that Ahasuerus kept? Because there's only 2 other places in the Hebrew Bible where we're told things about furnishings. There's only 2 other places in the Bible where furnishings become an issue. Number 1, when Moses makes the Mishkan. When Moses makes the tabernacle in the desert, the Bible, the Torah, goes to great lengths to tell us all the things it was decorated with. And 2, when Solomon builds the temple of Jerusalem. There again, we're told how it was decorated. Except here's the difference. Moses builds a tabernacle for the worship of God. Solomon builds a temple for the worship of God. The palace garden of Ahasuerus is being decorated in order to raise the spirits of a populace who's going to spend 7 days in drunken revelry. And you can begin to see the difference. You see what's going on. This is the world you're living in, a world where drunken revelry replaces worship. A world where wine is not kiddush. It's not the sanctification of holy moments that we spend with our families. Wine is inebriate. Wine is a way of jumping out of the world and losing your mind. Food is not a feast to be shared with family and friends on the occasion of a special moment, of a holiday, or on a simcha. Food is another escape from the realities of the world. And this is how the book of Esther begins. What would it be like to live in a world that's out of control? That's what the question's going to begin. And in case you miss it, now it's going to hammer it home. So we're right here. Royal wine was served in abundance as befits a king in golden beakers, beakers of varied design. So not only was royal wine available to everybody, but it had to be in nice bottles, taka, right? And the rule for drinking was no restrictions. No restrictions. Not just that you're permitted to drink as much as you want. The king will not allow you to have any control. The king does not permit you to have any discipline. His lack of discipline now becomes the rule for the whole kingdom. Everyone is to get royally sloshed. For the king had given orders to every palace steward to comply with each man's wishes. I like the, you ever see these pictures of Hugh Hefner's house, like the Playboy Club, you know? Like anything you would want. Beautiful women walking around scantily clad, wine, and there's this sense of which the id, the desires, the id, the impulses, they rule. There's no discipline, there's no order. What kind of kingdom is this? And at the same time, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace. So she's got the ladies upstairs and the men are downstairs getting sloshed. And what happens? Well, the first problem here, on the seventh day, when the king was merry with wine, he ordered, and then there's a whole list of guys here whose names I can't pronounce, the 7 eunuchs. Now we're going to discover that the eunuchs are actually the only men in the whole story, but that's a whole nother story. To bring Queen Vashti before the king wearing a royal diadem, that's her crown, to display her beauty to the peoples and the officials, for she was a beautiful woman. But Vashti refused to come at the king's command, conveyed by the eunuchs, and the king was greatly incensed, and fury burned within him. All right, so what happened? What happened? The guy spent 7 days drinking, and at the end of the 7th day, he's carousing with his buddies, the governors and the generals and the ambassadors and the rulers and the bureaucrats, and he says, I've shown you all of the riches and all of the treasures that I have collected in my conquests. Now I want to show you the greatest of them all. I want to show you my queen Vashti. She becomes the great treasure of the royal eye. She completely objectified. She is just another one of his treasures, but the most valuable of them all. For she was a beautiful woman. And the tradition, of course, is that when he said, come down wearing your crown, he meant come down wearing only your crown. Right, because I want to show them your, let me put it this way, your charms. How's that? And she refuses. Why does she refuse? She's the queen. Doesn't she have to obey the king's orders? Why does she refuse? All right, I need someone to help me here. Why does she refuse? What do we have going on here? Yes, Douglas, why does she refuse?
Human dignity?
Imagine that.
I mean, some sort of self-respect?
Yeah, okay. A resistance to being displayed, but he's the king. You're supposed to obey him, no? But this is the king after 7 days of drinking, right? So she says, I'm not playing along. I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. Right now, you gotta for a moment. I mean, this is, so you have 7 eunuchs and the queen, and she's the one with the cojones, right? I mean, think about what she's done here. What's going to be the punishment for a queen who publicly disobeys her husband, the king, in front of all the bureaucrats, the generals, the ambassadors, and the administrators of the kingdom? This is pretty serious, right? Stanley, go ahead.
But we need her to do that to tell the rest of the story.
Yes, I know, but I want to focus on the scene here, because what I'm suggesting here is that the scene is trying to give you a sense of what kind of world you're living in. You're living in a world where human dignity simply doesn't count. Nobody's dignity counts. That's the kind of world you're living in. Oh, let's see what happens. I know you want to know what happens. Let's see what happens. So the king is incensed. He's really mad. He's mad because his queen has disobeyed him. He's mad because she's disobeyed him in front of all of the guys who he rules. This is a serious breach of royal ethics. And it's a serious affront to the royal ego. Because here's a man who purports to rule the whole world, 127 provinces. He's conquered the whole world. And he can't even get one uppity woman to do what he wants. I mean, what happens to his authority under these circumstances? This is really dangerous. Then the king consulted the sages learned in procedure, for it was the royal practice to turn all to all who were versed in law and precedent. And he gives you all the names. The closest advisors were here, all the names, right? The 7 ministers of Persia and Media who had access to the royal presence and occupied the first place in the kingdom. So he's surrounded by all these wise men. And he has to ask them, what shall be done according to law to Queen Vashti for failing to obey the command of the king conveyed by the eunuchs? And the answer is, she should be put to some horrible death because she has destroyed any pretense of royal authority. She's poked a pin into his balloon, right? The emperor's new clothes. She's just exposed him as being a fraud. So what do you do to such a person? That's treason. That's the worst form of treason. Thereupon, Memucan. Now, Memucan is one of the advisors. Is he also one of the eunuchs? Let me see for a second. Yeah, no, he's an advisor, not a eunuch. And the question is who is this guy, Memucan? We don't know anything about him. The Midrashic tradition says he's Haman. He's Haman. And Haman was the guy's name after he became the advisor to the king. This is his real name. Could be, might not be. I don't think so. But there's a midrash to that effect, because I think Memucan does something really clever here. Memucan declared in the presence of the king and the ministers, Queen Vashti has committed an offense not only against your majesty, but against all the officials and against all the people, not people, it should be men, all the men in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will make all wives despise their husbands, as they reflect that King Ahasuerus himself ordered Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will cite it to all of your majesty's official, and there'll be no end to scorn and provocation. If it please your majesty, let a royal edict be issued by you and let it be written into the laws of Persia and Media. That's part of the game. Everything has to be a proclamation so that it can't be abrogated. That Vashti shall never again enter the presence of King Ahasuerus, and let your majesty bestow her royal state upon another who's more worthy than she. Then will the judgment executed by your majesty resound through the realm, vast though it is, and all wives will treat their husbands with respect, with reverence. They'll obey, high and low alike. The proposal was approved by the king and the ministers. They had a vote on it. And the king did as Memucan was proposed. Dispatches were sent to all the provinces of the king, every province in its own script. Got 127 kingdoms. That's 127 languages you have to translate this thing into. And notice that you have a communication system. You have sort of Pony Express. You have a way of getting this thing out to let everybody know that every man should wield authority in his home and speak the language of his own people. Ta-da! Now, I want to suggest 2 ways to read Memucan. Ready? Number 1, what is Memucan afraid of? What is he afraid of? Let's first take him at his word. What is he afraid of? Yes, Andy.
He's afraid that other women are going to follow this lead by the queen and will now not follow when the husband calls for them or asks them to do stuff. They will not do it.
And the problem with that is?
They're not considered a person, they're considered property.
Yeah, but what's the problem with them? What's the problem with them suddenly just saying, I claim human dignity? What's the problem with that? Go ahead, Sandy, what's the problem with that?
Well, he doesn't want her killed. I mean, because then you could have a revolution with the.
Well, that's a second. Let's leave her out for a second. Why? Andy got it exactly right. You got it exactly right. Women are going to start to claim some of the authority and some possibility for directing the destiny of their own lives. And what's the problem with that, Bert? What's the problem with that?
The problem is more general in that if the women can do that, the men can do that. And the general authority of the structure is then threatened. And if action isn't taken to crush that rebellion, his power through his ministers is going to simply fall apart.
All right, the whole social system's going to collapse.
There you go.
Ladies and gentlemen, do you know why women don't have the vote in the United States? Because if women started to think they could control the conditions of their own existence and men didn't rule their homes as castles, my God, the whole social system would collapse. I mean, this is the, on one level, this is the great argument against feminism since the beginning of time. Men are in charge. Women pay attention and listen to what men tell them to do. And this is patriarchy. And if Vashti could challenge Achashverosh, the patriarchy will collapse. And if patriarchy collapse, there'll be social chaos. And as Bert says, not only will the women start to claim, but everybody will start, the poor people will start to claim that they can control the conditions of their existence, and that they won't listen to the rich, and the commoners won't listen to the nobles, and nobody will listen to the king. Ladies and gentlemen, you let one uppity woman get away with it, and the whole thing comes tumbling down. Right? Anybody ever meet Phyllis Schlafly? Remember who Phyllis Schlafly was? I met Phyllis Schlafly. I moderated a conversation with Phyllis Schlafly once. Remember who Phyllis Schlafly was?
Yes.
Who is she? Come on, speak
She
up
was
so the
the-
youngins know who she is. They need to hear her name.
You know, she was the one who put aside Roe versus Wade. She was against abortion, but she really wasn't. She really was involved. She really started out to be against nuclear stuff. She totally turned around and became against women's rights, anti-feminist.
She became the personification of a resistance to feminism, right?
Oh, she was horrible.
In the name of traditional values.
Right.
Men should rule their castles. Women should be obedient to their husbands. Remember, there was that book that came out that recommended that women should wrap themselves in saran wrap and meet their husbands at the door ready for sex. Remember that? Do you remember that?
Well, was that kind of like in the olden days, walking around your husband 7 times?
Well, there was a story that some woman wrote a thing in the news that she did what this. It wasn't Phyllis Schlafly, it was this other woman who recommended this. She showed up at the door wearing a negligee one night when he came home from work, and what she didn't know is he was bringing 2 of his coworkers home for dinner unannounced. So this is the whole idea of patriarchy, and the utter sheer terror of men that women would rise up one day and take their own place in society. And they're terrified. And the idea that the whole social structure, the whole society would ground to a halt if men couldn't give orders and women wouldn't obey. And that all authority, that's what Bert said, all authority, the authority of the government, the authority of the king, the authority of rabbis, the authority of ministers and priests, every authority would be questioned if women could stand up and say no. If women could stand up and say no. This is a classic argument. So on one level, you hear the insecurity here. You hear Achashverosh's insecurity, and you hear the insecurity of the governing class of the Persian Empire. I mean, they're ruling 127 provinces. That's not an easy thing to do, to keep 127 countries in line. And there's a deep insecurity that if you pull out one of the, of the Jenga blocks, the whole thing's going to come crumbling down. One woman saying no to her husband, and the whole social structure comes down. That's one way to look at it. And it's just an interesting, such a revealing, I think it's a revealing, interesting picture. Not only is this a loony universe to be living in, but it's a loony universe full of loony people who are deeply insecure. And what's it like to be ruled by people who are insecure about their own authority, who have to protect their own authority at all costs? That's a very strange world to be in. Right? Now, let's take number 2. Maybe Memucan isn't that way. Let's take a different reading of it. Maybe Memucan likes Vashti and wants to save her life. So how do you save her life? Because look what the punishment is in the end. The punishment isn't some horrible death. What's the punishment? The punishment is she doesn't have to sleep with him ever again. Right? I got news for you. Really? No kidding. She doesn't have to come into his presence. She doesn't have to do what he tells her to do. Her punishment is she's free of him. Is that a punishment? I mean, think about that for just a second. She said, I'm not coming down. So Memucan makes it so he never has to come down to be with him. And the whole idea might have been a ruse. Make it a big deal. Make a big proclamation and save her life because you play to his ego, right? The punishment, dear king, is she will never have your favor again. Yeah, you know what? Saves her life. He saves her life. Both readings, I think, are plausible. But more and more, this first chapter sets out this image of what? What it's like to live in a Looney Tunes world. Look at the world you're living in. Drunk kings, wild banquets, disobedient wives, crazy stuff. Now, how do you live in such a world? The Torah is all about how to live in a world that's governed by a just and loving God. How do you live in a world governed by a drunk and crazy king? And now we go on to the next story. Sometime afterwards, when Achashverosh's anger subsided, he thought of Vashti and what he'd done, and what she had done, and what was decreed against her. So he misses her. He's home alone. The bed is cold. She was his favorite wife. And all of a sudden it occurs to him that he's made a decision and it's affected him. It has implications. Now, this is one of the characteristics of the story. It's one of the characteristics of his foolishness. And frankly, it's one of the characteristics is a kind of comedy. It's a kind of Keystone Cops, Laurel and Hardy comedy, where every choice, every decision brings implications that the character hasn't thought of that makes the problem bigger. Every time you do something, it creates unforeseen implications that makes the problem bigger. This is what happens when you rule by impulse without ruling by wisdom. I teach this to our kids. I have a little gift. Well, on rainy days, didn't rain today, so I couldn't tell the kids this. We have a little game. I speak to the elementary school kids. I say, listen, you guys got to do me a favor. You ready? You're going to see a puddle, and you're going to see one of the kids from the nursery school, and that kid's going to want to jump in the puddle because there's nothing more fun than jumping both feet in a puddle and seeing it splash. But you know what the problem with that is? We're all wearing sneakers. And if you jump in a puddle in sneakers, what do you get? You get a phenomenon that we like to call squishy sock. For the rest of the day, you have to walk around with wet socks, and that's not comfortable. It's really ugly because as the day goes on, your feet start to itch and it's cold and it's horrible. I said, you guys, you're in second grade and third grade and fourth grade. You can see what's going to happen. This is what the definition of intelligence is. The definition of intelligence is you know what's going to happen next. That's why you don't run into the street when you have to cross the street, but you look both ways. That's why you eat healthy food. That's why you don't jump into puddles, because you know what's going to happen next. But Achashverosh doesn't. The fundamental definition of intelligence is what's going to happen next. But having banished Vashti, he now realizes he lives cold, lonely existence. He has this giant regal bed and no one to share it with. And so the servants show up right away and they say, well, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for your majesty, and let your majesty appoint officers in every province of the realm to assemble all the beautiful young virgins of the fortress Shushan in the harem under the supervision of Haggai, the king's eunuch, guardian of the women. Now there's a job for your son. Let them be provided with their cosmetics. For some reason, cosmetics play a big role. And let the maiden who pleases your majesty be queen instead of Vashti. And the proposal pleased the king, so he acted upon it. So what was the proposal? Go and draft every marriageable young woman in the entire empire and bring her to the palace. Now, what bad could come of that? What bad could come of the fact that the king now conscripts every young woman in the kingdom who isn't married between the ages of 14 and 20? Can you possibly imagine what the bad after effects of that decision might be? Because Ahasuerus couldn't. So they go and they do it. And now we introduce two more characters. You ready? Everybody ready? In the fortress Shushan lived a Jew. Now, the word Jew here is important because it's Yehudi, a Judean. He was a Judean by the name of Mordechai, son of Yair, son of Shimi, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. Remember, Benjamin was the tribe next to Judah, and they were the ones that survived the destruction. Kish had been exiled, so his grandfather, or great-grandfather, son of Yair, that's his father, son of Shimi, his grandfather. His great-grandfather had been exiled from Jerusalem with the group that had been taken by King Yehoiah with Judah, driven into exile by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. So his great-grandfather was taken to Babylon, and then from Babylon, the family migrated to Persia. And there he grew up, son of Shimi, son of Yair. Now, the interesting thing is that Kish, Shimi, and Yair are all Hebrew names. Mordechai's not. Mordechai is derived from Marduk. Who was Marduk? Marduk was the patron god of the Babylonians, the people who destroyed Jerusalem and brought us into exile. So what's happened here is that here we have the quintessential assimilated Jew. How assimilated is he? He bears the name of the God of the people who sent us into exile, right? How many generations will it take before Jewish kids are named Adolf? That's what we got here. Nebuchadnezzar worshipped Marduk. Mordechai is Marduk. That's the name. He bears the name of the God of the people who exiled us. Just consider that for a minute. That's remarkable, right? He was foster father to Hadassah. Hadassah is her Hebrew name. That is Esther. So she has a Hebrew name and a Persian name. Some of us have Hebrew names and English names. She has two names. Esther means two things. Esther in Hebrew, it's not a Hebrew name, it's a Persian name. But in Hebrew, if you take it from the root lahastir, meaning she's hidden, which is going to be her story, that's a hint about the life she's going to live. But Esther in ancient in Eastern languages, in Mesopotamian, Esther is from Astarte. Astarte is the female consort of the god Ishtar. Astarte, that's the female goddess. So Mordechai and Esther have the names of the gods of our enemies. That's how long they've lived in exile. She was his uncle's daughter. So if somebody's your uncle's daughter, that makes you what, a cousin? Is that how that works? She had neither father nor mother. And so Mordechai apparently had adopted her. The maiden, and in case you wondered, the maiden was shapely and beautiful. And when her father and mother died, he adopted her as his own daughter. When the king's order was proclaimed, and many girls were assembled in the fortress Shushan under the supervision of Haggai, Esther too was taken to the king's palace under the supervision of Haggai, guardian of the women. Now, wait a minute. Did he send her, or was he forced to send her? Could he have hidden her? In the Moses story, all the boys are thrown into the Nile, so the mother of Moses hides him, and that's how he survives the destruction. Could Mordechai have hidden Esther, or did he want her to go to the palace? Why would he have wanted her to go to the palace? Why would he have wanted her to go to the palace?
Access to power?
Yeah, could be. Could be she had a chance. I mean, she's a beautiful girl. He's looking for a beautiful girl. Maybe this was Mordechai's plan all along, right? It says the girl pleased him and won his favor, and he hastened to furnish her with cosmetics and rations, as well as 7 maids who were her due from the king's palace. So what do we have here? What do we have here? She has this wonderful power. She has a power which is reminiscent of Joseph. Remember Joseph? Joseph goes to Egypt and he charms everybody. First, he charms Potiphar, and then he charms Potiphar's wife, and then he charms the prison warden, and then he charms the cupbearer, and then he charms the Pharaoh. Esther has a little bit of that. Esther has a little bit of that charm. So she goes in there, and Haggai, who's the eunuch in charge of the harem, she like charms him. She like charms, so she gets in good with this guy, and he gives her gift certificates to Sephora and Chanel number 5, right? And then it tells. So what happens when and every single day, Esther did not reveal her people. It's an important line. Esther did not reveal her people or her kindred, for Mordecai told her not to reveal it. Why not? Why not? Why not? Why couldn't he reveal it? Why couldn't she tell anyone she's Jewish? What does that tell you about Mordecai? Come on. What does that tell you about Mordecai?
He's fearful.
Why?
He's fearful that he must recognize the anti-Semitism within his society.
Douglas, how many generations your family in America?
Depends. The longest you could go would be 4.
4.
5 if you want to count my kids.
Okay. So Mordecai is in exile as long as you've been in America. 4 generations. Right?
Yeah.
You ever tell your kids, don't tell them you're Jewish?
We live in America.
Okay. That's true. That's true. That's fair enough.
Would I tell my, when Lindsay went on an exchange program with Israel, she lived at the home of a French expatriate. Would you tell the French expatriates, somebody living in Paris to go tell them?
Good question. Good question.
Hell no.
How long do you have to live in a society before you lose that fear?
Depends on the society.
Depends on the society. Very interesting. So Mordecai, who's named for the God of the people who exiled us, still hangs on to this vestige of Jewish fear. Don't tell the goyim that we're here. Don't tell the goyim that we're here. He's worried. They might find prejudice, right? It turns out later, by the way, that it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. Don't tell the goyim that we're here. So you're beginning to see that this is a story about how a Jewish community copes with exile. Because this is a story that takes place entirely outside the land of Israel. And it's the story of a Jewish community that has no power. This is not about the armies of King David. This is not about the armies of the walls of Jerusalem erected by Hezekiah. In diaspora, we have no power. And the question of the book of Esther is going to be, one of the political questions it's going to ask us is, how do you survive in a crazy society, in a crazy, upside down, morally weird world if you have no power? What do you need to do in order to survive? That's part of the lesson of the book of Esther. What are you going to need to do? So let's finish this part, and then we're going to call it a day because I want to get through this part. Now, you remember when we were kids in Hebrew school, there was a beauty contest? That's what they told us in Hebrew school. Not a beauty contest, guys. It's something a whole lot worse. In fact, it's something that's sort of rated X. So Andy, put your hands over your daughter's ears. Ready? Right? When each girl's turn came to go to King Ahasuerus, at the end of 12 months treatment prescribed for women, that was the period of beautifying, 6 months in oil of myrrh and 6 months in perfumes and cosmetics. In other words, each girl was marinated in Chanel number 5 for a year, right? And then each night, a different woman went in to spend the night with the king. I mean, when you think about what this is legislated rape. And then if you're favored, you get taken into the king's service. But if you're not, what happens to you? Well, now that the king's had her for one night, she's no longer, as it were, marriageable. And she goes and lives the rest of her life in the harem as a slave to the palace. I mean, that's what happened to girls who were sort of, the consorts of the king who didn't end up marrying him. It's a terrifying thing, right? And when she was right, she would go in the evening and leave in the morning for the second harem in charge of Shagaz, the king's eunuch guardian of the concubines. And she would not go again to the king unless the king wanted her, and she was summoned by name. That's the terror of this thing. This is organized rape. And except that when the turn came for Esther, daughter of Avichail, and it's interesting that here we learn his name. We didn't learn it before. And Avichail means my father is a hero. That's what the name means.
Oh,
Who had adopted her as his own daughter to go to the king. She didn't ask for anything. And yet Esther won the admiration of all who saw her. She was taken to Achashverosh in the 10th month, which is the month of Tevet, of the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than all the other women. She won his grace and favor more than all the other virgins. So he set a royal diadem on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a banquet. There's our second banquet for all of his officials and courtiers, the banquet of Esther, and proclaimed remission of taxes for the provinces and distributed gifts as befits a king. So the king marries Esther. By the way, how long between the exile of Vashti and the marriage to Esther? 4 years. 4 years, 365 days, a different woman each night. How many women did he run through, as it were? That's like what, 1,300 women, right? That's a lot of girls before you meet the love of your life. That's like J-date, you know? And then he meets Esther and he falls in love with her, and they have a banquet. And what's the result of the banquet? Everybody gets a write-off. Now you know it's a Jewish book, right? What's the present? What's the wedding present he gives the whole kingdom? Everybody gets a write-off. Everybody gets a deduction. Well, now it's a crazy world. Let's stop here. But I want you to think about this. The book of Esther is asking us a really painful question. What if there isn't a God who rules the world? What if there isn't a layer of justice in the world? What if the world is random and loony and crazy and ruled by impulsive, drunk people? Then what would you have to do? What would be the Torah of living in such a world? That's a really brutal question to ask, but it's the question that this book wants to take up. So let's stop here. Any questions, counter sermons? Yes, Douglas, you're up.
The world you're describing, it seems to me that the philosophers, the political philosophers, Hobbes and Locke, have addressed that, and they called that the state of nature.
Hobbes did, yeah. Locke was a little more civilized.
Yeah. No, Locke said you had some certain rights, and that, right, to get from the state of nature to those rights, you had to organize governments. But both of those, Hobbes was more fearful of what was in that day, and therefore justified autocracy more because of how horrible that was.
Yes.
But, I guess you would say that those guys were deists or humanists, or.
Well, but here's the bigger question. How would you have to live as a citizen if you're living in a kingdom which resembles the state of nature? So Hobbes tells us that justifies autocracy. But the question isn't here. The question is, we're not looking at it from the point of view of the top, of the king, of government. We're looking at it from the place of the citizen. If you're a citizen and you realize you're living in the state of nature, how do you navigate that universe without getting killed? How do you navigate that universe?
The easy solution is power.
Well, that's what we're going to find out. That's what we're going to find out. That's coming. Access to power is exactly what this story is about. That's what's coming next. That's the next episode. Okay. Anyone else? Questions, comments? Well, then let's stop here, because it's a happy ending up to this point. Esther's queen and all is good. So let's stop now, because next week it's going to get more dicey, right? And we'll pick it up next week together. Okay.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
I think somebody mentioned the 7 times around.
Yeah.
That is still done in Orthodox weddings?
Yeah, but it's even in our weddings. Nobody quite knows where that custom came from. It has some resonance with dances that women would do in order to entice their husbands. It has some reference to the idea that her life revolves around him. It's done in many weddings, even not Orthodox weddings. Sometimes now we do it 3 and 3 and 1. She walks around him 3 times. He walks around her 3 times. They make a swing about once, which is more egalitarian, but it's still done.
Give us you must marry hundreds of people. What percentage is done at the 7 times?
Very few, but a few people that like traditional ways of doing things. There's still some people that like doing that.
I wouldn't do it. I did
Okay.
not walk around.
Okay.
But my daughter walked 3 times and he walked 3 times. That's a beautiful way to end it. A beautiful, that's equality. That's lovely.
Okay.
I think it's a wonderful answer.
My mother, who grew up Shomer Shabbos and had Shomer Shabbos relatives, started doing that, and in the middle of it said F this S, and that's one of the great family stories.
All right, everybody, let's call it a day.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful afternoon. I'm teaching tonight at 7 o'clock. If anybody wants to tune in again, going to be talking about how do you respond to when bad things happen to good people? The question of evil in the world.
We just can't get enough of you.
I know.